The nature of our relationship with government is that we give up our personal liberties in order to secure security from ourselves, from outsiders. And he is arguing, I think, that government is costing us too much, not because government is evil in general, but because the government we have now is taking more than it should.
Welcome to Unpacking Ideas, the podcast where each episode we unpack an influential piece of writing from the past in order to make it more accessible in the present. Today we're looking at Common Sense by Thomas Paine. Helping me unpack this book today was Jared Shoup. We got into Paine's thoughts on the differences between society and government, the function of government, the anti-monarchy sentiments in the Old Testament, the origins of monarchy, Paine's critique of monarchy and hereditary succession, his critiques of the British constitutional monarchy and King George, and his thoughts on the path forward for the American colonies, as well as what he believed an American government should look like. We also spent the first section of the episode talking about the historical context of the book and Thomas Paine's background. So if you're already kind of feeling sharp on your American history, feel free to skip that section to minute marker 20, where we dive into the book itself. I really enjoy talking to Jared about this subject. As you'll hear, he has a background teaching American history and government, so he's taught this subject before and knows it in and out. And also, he's my cousin, so that just made it super easy to talk to him about this stuff. So here it is, guys. I hope you get some value out of it. My conversation with Jared on Common Sense. All right, we are recording. Welcome, Jared.
Thank you very much, Zach.
Yeah, so usually I start off the podcast talking about how I met my guest, but being as we are cousins, I've known you since you were a baby, literally.
Yeah,
a
long time. You've known me 27 years. I've sort of technically known you that long, but I don't think you really gained sentience until about 4.
Yeah, right.
So maybe I have 23 years worth of Christmases, Thanksgivings,
of
various holidays with you. Yeah.
That you have no memory of. Yeah, I'd say that's fair. They call that childhood amnesia.
Childhood amnesia.
It's a fancy way of saying, like, you don't remember anything before the age of 3.
That makes perfect sense.
But awesome. So, and then this is what happens if you have a cousin who teaches high school government, is you have him on your podcast to talk about Thomas Paine. So this is cool because we've kind of talked a little bit about like American history and whatnot, and you've recommended some books to me over the years.
Indeed.
So I was kind of thinking it would be really cool to talk about, we were thinking either Thomas Paine or doing like the Federalist Papers or something, but we landed on Paine, and it's really cool. So you teach economics and government now?
Right now, just economics.
Okay.
A few years ago, it was just government. Then it was government and econ. Mm-hmm. And I've landed on economics, which is a niche I love. I love teaching it. It's super practical. But I'm very passionate about history. Yeah. And I'm one of the faculty leads of our History Geeks Club.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So diving into Thomas Paine, diving into the history of this book and its impact was a fun experience, and I'm definitely going to do a History Geeks lesson about, Common Sense and Thomas Paine at some point this year.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. I don't think it was even mentioned in my high school government class, which you made a surprised face. Do you teach it, or did you teach it when you taught government? Yeah,
when we teach government, and I believe in the American history class, you will at least talk a little bit about common sense, because in the time period, this was everywhere. This was being read in taverns. This was one of the main documents that was really inspiring people to join the American Revolution.
I read somewhere that when you look at, the population at that time, around 50% of people bought and read this, which is crazy. I can't even imagine that happening today.
And 50% of people buying it, that means way more people are reading it and listening to it, because you might buy a book, you're probably going to share it with your friend. With a YouTube video, you might watch it on your own.
Yeah.
You might then show it to somebody else. You may even watch it in a group. That means far more than 50% of people are exposed to it.
yeah, that means only one person would have to buy it for a whole tavern to be exposed to it in that case. Maybe we can back up a little bit and give a little bit of context for this piece. This is something that I don't always do on the podcast, but I think with this particular piece, it's going to be really important to have some context of both who Thomas Paine was and kind of what was happening in the American colonies when this was written, kind of like the lead up. So maybe we can start with kind of the historical context and then talk about like when Paine kind of wanders into this, story.
That sounds good.
Maybe we can just talk a little bit about like the French-Indian War.
Oh, yeah.
Some of these like intolerable acts, like kind of why the political climate was so tense.
Okay. Yeah, the French and Indian War was fought about 40 years before the American Revolution starts. So like 1754, 1763. The French and Indian War is primarily fought on what is the western frontier at the time. So it's taking place in what would become the Ohio Territory, what would become the Indiana Territory, and it is very much fought between American soldiers on the ground, led by many British officers, and a lot of important figures who would go on to become American generals. George Washington was a general or a captain during the French and Indian War, and France is stirring up some Native American tribes, getting them to fight the Americans as well. And the French and Indian War ends with an American victory. British take control of more pieces of Canada than they previously had.
American-British victory? Correct?
Yes, American-British victory.
Yeah.
I shouldn't say American victory because at that time, we're still part of England. Great Britain is not even considering that America will be independent at some point.
Right.
And America ends up saddled with a lot of Britain's war debt. Britain sort of sees themselves as having fought a war on America's behalf. And as a result, the colonists owe some money to the British Crown. King George decides to take his money in the form of extra taxes placed on the colonists, which they don't like. They don't have any representation in the British Parliament who is able to levy taxes and make laws. So when a number of acts come around taxing things like sugar, paper products, and tea. We take offense to that.
Yeah. From my understanding, some of that is the whole idea of taxation without representation. Like, we shouldn't be taxed if we're not able to vote on these people who are kind of legislating the tax. But is some of that also the Americans kind of feeling like, hey, this wasn't like all our war. This was also like benefiting the British as well.
Yeah, America is seeing this war as furthering the king's agenda. It really depends on the American at the time. Some, like Thomas Paine goes on to say later in this book, is saying that the king is fighting a war in America for British principles.
Okay.
Basically, it's the king's war, has nothing to do with us. Others would say that the French and Indian War was necessary to defend and secure our borders. Benjamin Franklin might have been a little more of that opinion.
Okay.
And when England does decide to tax the colonies, it isn't seen by everybody as like England overstepping their bounds.
That makes sense. And then from my kind of understanding too, these taxes and these acts kind of got more and more outrageous. Like, there was a kind of building where, like, by the time you get to like 1765, you get like the Quartering Act, where they're just like, you know, telling the colonists you have to allow this British soldier to just like sleep in your guest bedroom.
Yes, the Quartering Act is one of the most offenses because people who consider themselves to be British citizens, Benjamin Franklin, one of those guys who was like, yeah, I'm British, I'm a British American. In the English Bill of Rights, it specifically prohibits the Crown or any governing body from forcing people to quarter soldiers in their homes.
Oh, okay.
But America was made an exception to this. And the Quartering Act stated that it was the responsibility of local municipalities to construct barracks for soldiers. And if those barracks could not be constructed, it was the responsibility of governments to house them in other types of buildings like inns. And if no inns were available, it would be the responsibility of everyday citizens to just house British soldiers in their homes, basically turning their house into an Airbnb,
Wow.
making them breakfast, providing for their food, medical care.
Okay, so the kind of hypocrisy added insult to injury that they're like the British don't even have to do this. They're not even playing by their own rules.
Yeah, it's disrespectful.
Yeah, for sure.
We are not being treated as equal citizens.
Right.
If, in fact, England is our mother country, we should have the same rights as all the other English people. We should have a seat in the House of Commons where any British citizen can cast a vote for a legislature, but we don't have any of that.
Makes sense. So then some of these kind of retaliatory efforts on the part of the colonists would include like the Boston Tea Party. And then one of the things that Paine mentions quite a bit in Common Sense is the Battle of Lexington and Concord.
Yeah, April 19th.
Yeah, can you kind of refresh us on what happened there?
Yeah, I will actually read a little bit of Paine's writing.
Yeah, because he seems to see this as like the turning point.
It absolutely is the turning point. Let's see. So he says, all plans, proposals, etc., prior to the 19th of April, to the commencement of hostilities, like the almanacs of last year, which, though proper then, are superseded and useless now. He's saying that anything that we made in terms of laws deals with Great Britain. Anything in our political system, it's all useless. Once the actual fighting started, once the shot heard round the world was fired, and the Battle of Lexington and Concord began, it's game over for England. There is no chance of reconciliation. A lot of Americans, Thomas Paine included, no longer see themselves as British citizens, although Thomas Paine at this point was definitely British, but we'll talk about that in a little bit, I guess. There isn't a particularly strong American identity at this point because there isn't an American country. Thomas Paine in the book goes on to break down, like, if you have two Englishmen who are traveling the country and they realize, they live on the same street, they're neighbors. If you have two Englishmen traveling abroad and they meet, they'll say, my fellow countrymen. But America doesn't have that same privilege. It's sort of at this point the same with the states. If you meet somebody from Massachusetts and you yourself live in Virginia, you're not going to be like, look, my fellow countrymen.
Yeah.
No, you'd be like, okay, you're a American British citizen like myself. I'm from Virginia, you're from Massachusetts. We're different. We have different interests. We have different goals. My state is the best. No, my state is the best.
Yeah.
And
They're kind of viewing themselves almost like 13 separate countries.
Very
at that
much.
Point. Yeah. That makes sense. Okay, so maybe we can start to bring Thomas Paine into the mix. So he arrives in America in 1774 from Britain. He's born and raised in England, and he doesn't come to America until he's 37.
Yeah.
And I think that's just such a wild place to find yourself in. You know, I'm not even 37. So to arrive in a country that is not your home country when you're 37, and then to like 2 years later write what then becomes like one of the most influential American books ever written, that like pretty much kicks off the Revolutionary War, is pretty wild.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it wasn't even 2 years that he was here. It was,
really?
I believe,
a year and a half or something like that.
I wrote this down. 13 months.
13 months.
13 months.
Yeah.
And the first month, he was completely out of commission. So if I could just talk through Thomas Paine's background.
Please.
So, like, Thomas Paine is, before he comes to America, many different things in his life. He is born the son of a guy who makes corsets, but he lives in this sort of very rural part of England. There's not a lot of business. So he grows up relatively poor. He does manage to go to school. He has a talent for writing. But as he gets older, he finds himself in many different careers. He is at one point a privateer. He's a sailor very briefly. He finds himself as a tax collector. He finds himself as a shop owner of selling like tobacco products. And when he finds himself in London in 1774, he's broke. He has run up a lot of debts. He has lost his job with the government because he wrote some pamphlets on why British tax collectors are being mistreated. I mean, he's like a labor activist at this point, too.
Okay, yeah.
And that is when he meets Benjamin Franklin, when he's at one of the lowest points in his life. Benjamin Franklin, famous printer from Philadelphia. Not a lot is known about, their initial meeting, but what is known is that Benjamin Franklin talked to him, said, "Oh, you're down on your luck. Why don't you try resettling in America?" And he writes Thomas Paine a letter of recommendation. Says, "Head to Philadelphia. You've got, a letter of recommendation from me. I'm pretty well known there."
That'd be a good guy to get a letter of recommendation from. Yeah,
very good guy to get a letter of recommendation from. So he hops on a boat and arrives in Philadelphia in November of 1774, just at the end of the year, and he is sick as a dog.
Wow.
He is so sick, I believe it was typhoid, that he is bedridden for 6 weeks.
Wow.
At the end of that 6 weeks, he's finally able to get up, goes searching for a job, and I believe by March of 1775, he finds himself in the position of editor for the Pennsylvania Magazine, which was not supposed to be a political magazine, but Thomas Paine turns it into a political commentary.
Okay. Does he get this job through Franklin's letter of recommendation? Yeah. Okay.
Definitely.
Yeah.
He definitely leverages this letter of recommendation. I have heard that Thomas Paine sort of lied about his background a little bit.
Okay. Stretch the truth, maybe.
Yeah. So I believe the people
who doesn't lie on their resume, though?
Yeah, just a little bit of lying on the resume, just a little exaggeration. Yeah. The Pennsylvania Magazine was looking for a British newspaper editor, and Thomas Paine was not a British newspaper editor, but he could write. He had written political pamphlets before. He had written a series of complaints about why British excise officers are being mistreated.
Okay, yeah.
So he manages to convince the magazine to hire him as the editor. And while they don't want it to be a political magazine, he sees that politics is what the readership wants.
Yeah. And
he turns it into a place for political discussion. He turns it into a magazine where the ideas which he would later write in Common Sense are beginning to form.
Yeah, like he's already pretty anti-monarchy at that point. Okay, so he arrives 1774, so Boston massacres happen, Boston Tea Parties happen, Quartering Act, like all of these things have kind of already, the kettle is already pretty close to a boil by the time he lands, and then 13 months later, he writes Common Sense.
Which was originally supposed to be titled Plain Truth.
Okay.
But anyways, Benjamin Rush was a influential figure here who was like, you should call it Common Sense.
Yeah, it flows off the tongue better.
It does.
Well, cool. So I think that sets the stage pretty well. Is there anything you want to add before we dive into the text?
I like to think of Thomas Paine as a reaction YouTuber.
Okay.
He kind of is, he just sort of just waltzes into the scene, sees, oh, wow, I was right. Monarchy sucks. It's happening here, and these people hate it. I should probably start writing. And he does. He becomes really influential.
I like that, because he's I guess, has a fresh set of eyes on this. Like he arrives, like I said, right near the kind of boiling point, and it's just like, the hell is going on?
Yeah.
And like, as we'll get into, a lot of what he's trying to do with this piece is convince the colonies, one, that they need to unite, and he's trying to argue that separation is what is needed. Because from my understanding, a lot of the colonists, including prominent figures like Benjamin Franklin, at this point are still thinking like, hey, maybe we can just like work things out with Britain.
Yeah, they wanted to reconcile. They wanted to continue to be part of Britain.
So in that way, Paine is a little more radical than some of these other founding fathers.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, cool. Well, let's dive into it. So I was thinking we could just read the first paragraph of the preface and kind of unpack that. Do you mind doing the honors?
Read it?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. Some writers have so confounded society with government as to leave little or no distinction between them, whereas they are not only different, but have different origins. Society is produced by our wants, and government by our wickedness. The former promotes our happiness, positively, by uniting our affections. The latter, negatively, by restraining our vices. The one encourages intercourse, the other creates distinctions. The first is a patron, the last, a punisher.
So the way I understood that is he's saying like a lot of people conflate society and government, whereas they're two separate things, and we need to think about them differently. And from what I'm hearing from that is he says like society is, how does he say it? He says society positively promotes our happiness by uniting our affections. So he uses this example a little later on where he's saying like, if you had a group of people who settled in a new land, they would naturally be drawn to society because there are all these benefits for society. One, just being that like we're social animals and we need other people, like no man is an island. And then the other thing that he's big on is like you can just achieve so many more things with a group than you can by yourself. And he uses the example of like building a cabin. Like it would take one person years to build a cabin if they ever could. And he's skeptical that like even if you were just one person, like you couldn't build a cabin by yourself. Like especially in those times, you can't lift this giant plank of wood.
Yeah, but no power tools.
Yeah, no power tools. No pickup trucks. But you know, with a group of people, like a group of people can build a bunch of cabins together. So there's kind of his idea that society is for our benefit, I think, is where he starts.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And he makes a clear distinction between society and government, society being the natural order of things, humans getting together, providing for one another's public good, which is something that when I teach government or economics, we have lessons on what is a public good, what is a merit good, and government provides for all of these, but our idea of government, he is arguing, is like synonymous with what he is calling society. But he is saying that government in itself isn't what is providing the public goods, that's society.
Yeah.
He's arguing that government is creating laws, government is protecting us from ourselves.
Right. And then he also says somewhere else that like, in a perfect world, if everyone was just, you know, moral and virtuous, we wouldn't need government. We would be able to just exist in this society. But as we all know, that's not how humans are.
No.
We have these vices. So government is basically set up to kind of protect us from ourselves. Maybe I'll read this quote here. He says, like dress, government is the badge of lost innocence. It ruins the bowers of paradise, furnish the foundations of royal palaces. And then this is the sentiment that I just was talking about. He says, if the impulses of conscience were clear, uniform, and irresistibly obeyed, humans would need no other lawgiver. However, that not being the case, people find it necessary to surrender part of their properties to help protect the rest. They have to choose the lesser of two evils. And it seems that he does see government as an evil, but like the better of two evils.
Mm-hmm. A necessary evil.
A necessary evil, yeah. He seems to advocate for this idea of like a kind of like minimum effective dose of government. You know, they talk about that with medication. Mm-hmm. Like you want to take the minimum amount of medication you need in order to have the effect necessary, but, you know, not to overdo it. And he says, security is the true design and end of government. Therefore, we should choose the form of government most likely to achieve it at the lowest cost and for the greatest benefit of everybody. And I was going to ask you, when he says cost there, do you think he's literally talking about government being a cost in terms of like taxes or the way you pay for government, or cost in terms of like in order to participate in a government or in a society, you have to sacrifice some of your you know, liberties in the sense that you'd have to, you know, sacrifice the fact that I can't just kill anybody I want to, or I can't just steal anything I want to.
I think in that case, he's talking less about taxes and more about personal freedom.
Okay.
The nature of our relationship with government is that we give up our personal liberties in order to secure security from ourselves, from outsiders. And he is arguing, I think, that government is costing us too much, not because government is evil in general, but because the government we have now is taking more than it should. It is far bigger than it has any right to be, and we are giving up personal liberty. We are giving up actual money in the form of taxes, which the colonists really hated, and the people of America are also giving up their own identity and their own potential. Thomas Paine sees so much potential in this continent, but he believes that Britain as a governing body is stifling us, and the cost isn't present, it's going to be a future cost.
Okay. Interesting. That makes a lot of sense.
The first two sections are super philosophical.
Yeah.
And he does a lot of drawing on biblical references. In that quote you read where he talks about government is like a badge of lost innocence, it's like clothes, that's a reference to Adam and Eve, who in the garden, when they had the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, suddenly they realized, oh my gosh, we're naked, oh, this is bad, we got to put on some clothes. Yeah. He's saying government is the same way. It's us, oh no, we've lost our innocence. We need protection from ourselves. Maybe you would need government because there are people in the community doing evil things. But you need to have some sort of distinction between right and wrong. And I guess if government is providing that, the minimum effective dose is going to be those sets of laws, distinctions between right and wrong, and maybe the ability to enforce that.
Yeah.
So later in this same chapter, Paine will talk about how he believes it is monarchy that is really the ultimate evil in terms of government. And he continues in his biblical references. He talks about how Gideon drives out the Midianites with a very small army, and the Israelites are then like, oh my gosh, Gideon, you're awesome, you should be our king, and your kids should be our kings too. And Gideon's just like, no, that's stupid. God is the one who won here, it wasn't me. Shame on you.
Right. And so it is very interesting that he brings these kind of like scriptural references, and you know, because he is speaking to colonists who I'm guessing by and large were Christian.
Oh yeah.
So I think in this first section, one of the things that he's trying to do is get rid of this idea that monarchy is a good institution, or this idea that kings are like ordained by God, which is, I think, a common belief. So I think that's why he is then pointing to scripture and saying, like, if you actually read scripture, the Israelites were anti-monarchy, and they believed, like you mentioned with Gideon, they believed that actually no man should be king. Like, God is the only king.
Yeah, that was it. Israel didn't have a centralized government. They had 12 tribes, and each of the 12 tribes had elders, leaders. It really was just a series of local governments. Maybe you could even compare them to the states at that time, because each state at this time had its own legislature, had its own government, made their own laws for themselves, but we didn't have a central government. We didn't have a king for ourselves, except England. And he is arguing that Israel didn't have a king, and once they did have a king, that then became a source of their problems. He argues that, he doesn't argue, he just says, and quotes from scripture, saying that the king is going to take the best of your lands, take 1/10 of your manservant, 1/10 of your womanservants, 1/10 of your vineyards, and give it to his subjects, his own servants. And that's exactly what the King of England does. He also specifically goes into the fact that the divinity of kings is not something that is in the Bible, but it is something that the papacy and the King of France and the King of England just sort of ignore.
And on that, he says, quote, "The natural rights of humanity do not justify exalting one man so above the rest. Neither does the authority of Scripture. Monarchists have glossed over the anti-monarchy parts of Scripture."
In the Psalms, mostly written by David, he doesn't refer to himself as the king. He is a man after God's own heart.
Yeah. Well, and then, so then he kind of gets into like, all right, well then, what are the origins of kings? Because he's saying like, it's not that God has just, appointed this person to be a king and said like, you will rule and then your offspring will rule. He's like, what actually happened? Paine says it's much more bleak. He says, quote, "The present generation of kings in the world did not have honorable origins. Beneath the dark cover of antiquity, many of them had ancestors who were simply the head of ruffians and roaming gangs. They had gained the title of chief among plunderers through savagery and subtlety. Afterwards, they had increased their power, extended their depredations, and overawed quiet and defenseless folk into buying their safety through regular contributions. Few, if any, records existed in those days. Much of traditional history consists of fables. After the lapse of few generations, it would be easy to trump up some superstitious tale and cram heredity down the throats of the unsophisticated at a convenient time." And I found this super interesting. I don't know how true this is historically. I've not kind of read some like the modern histories on, the origins of monarchy. But this idea that, it was basically just like, these people coming to power through just force. And then after a couple of generations, the history is kind of forgotten and they're able to kind of say, oh, well, my great grandfather was, an angel came down and appointed him king or whatever, rather than like, my great grandfather was a thug who kind of like plundered and, took this kingdom by force.
Absolutely. And in that quote, he also writes, and you mention, there isn't historical data on this. We don't really know what happened. But if we do look at some historical accounts of just like the Roman emperors, it really is just sort of survival of the fittest as to who's going to be the emperor. It's whoever is the most cunning. It's whoever is going to be able to step on the most people to seize the throne. It isn't somebody who's appointed by God, or maybe you could say it's someone appointed by Providence, but it's sort of Darwinian.
I think of Nero's mother murdering her husband so that Nero could have the throne. Like, there's a lot of backstabbing and
a lot of backstabbing with Roman emperors.
Yeah. And maybe to us in the 21st century, this is like a little less shocking, or maybe a little more cynical or more
Monarchy's
realistic.
Bad?
Yeah. But at the time, just the idea that somebody is suggesting like, oh yeah, this king that you think is so great, like he didn't come to power through, God appointing him this position. Like his ancestors were thugs. Like I'm sure that blew a lot of people's minds.
Oh yeah, he talks about how William the Conqueror, it's like, here, William the Conqueror. Yes, one of the kings of England. But this guy was an invader. He came into England and he declared himself king by beating up everybody else.
Yeah.
That is the origins of how we have a monarchy in England. It's not a great situation.
So, and then I think in this, the second section, he's also kind of tying in here, he's kind of trying to poke at this idea of hereditary succession as well, which is kind of, lumped in with his attacks against monarchy. And I thought this was really like cleverly written. So maybe I'll just read this quote here. And he says, "Nature disapproves of the folly of having hereditary kings. Otherwise, she would not so often expose the institution to ridicule by giving the people an ass instead of a lion to reign over them."
That was a good quote.
I thought that was just such a clever way to say, like, yeah, a lot of times the son of a great king is just like a real dumbass. And I think of like, you were talking about the Roman emperor, like Commodus.
Yeah, oh my gosh.
Who was Marcus Aurelius's son and really fucked things up pretty big time.
Marcus Aurelius was like, my son's got to be the emperor. He wasn't good enough.
Yeah.
I just want to be a gladiator.
Yeah. And I mean, again, like here in the 21st century, the idea that it's maybe not a great idea for like just whoever happens to be the offspring of a king to be the next ruler, like that's a bad idea. That seems pretty obvious to us now. But again, there was a lot of kind of like superstition and
yeah. One other thing I want to talk about is that I think the Bible at this time is not just a religious document, it's a historical text. And I believe that Thomas Paine is using the Bible as a historical text.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Taking all of this with a grain of salt now is just like second nature.
Yeah.
But to Paine and his readers, I think this section is reading much more history than allegory.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Maybe we can jump to a section in section 1 that we skipped over a little bit, which is where he's critiquing the current form of British government.
Yeah, first, second, third.
Yeah, because we've talked about his critiques of monarchy and hereditary succession more generally, but maybe we can kind of drill down on his critique of the British government.
Yeah, he's not a fan of George. Not at all.
He seems to think that this current British government is just like way too complicated. I'll kind of read this so you can see where he's going with it. But he says, "The English Constitution is so complex, the nation can suffer for years without discovering where the fault lies. Some will point here, others elsewhere. Every political doctor will prescribe a different medicine." I think the same is true when it comes to like a business or a corporation, where it's like, if you have an extremely complicated sales model and you're not making sales, it's not super apparent right away why you're not making sales, because there could be 10 different factors. And I think that's why he says, although there's plenty of problems with absolute governments, the one thing it does have going for it is you can easily tell why it's not working.
Oh yeah.
If you have a dictator, like it doesn't take a political theorist to figure out why this thing isn't working.
Oh yeah, back in just simple monarchy, if there's any kind of problem, whether it's foreign invaders or a drought, it's the king's fault. Let's just kill the king and that'll solve our problems. But we can't do that with this weird constitutional monarchy, which at this point, the Magna Carta, the first document that would really outline British laws, is over 500 years old. Like the Magna Carta, which the English Bill of Rights would be, built upon, was twice as old as our Constitution is today. I think he is definitely arguing that the system is super old and bogged down and it isn't representing us. And even the English Bill of Rights was written in 1688, 1689. That would be like a 90-year-old document right now. It's difficult to pinpoint where the problem is because history has changed a lot. And it wasn't being amended,
Yeah.
Oh, can I go through one thing?
Yeah.
So one thing I really like in section 1, which we skipped over because I was like, I want to talk about Gideon. He says, first, the remains of monarchical tyranny in the person of the king. Second, remains of aristocratical tyranny in persons of the peers. And thirdly, in the new republican materials in the persons of the common on whose virtue depends on the freedom of England. He is saying that there's a long and difficult set of prejudices that we need to get over. Those three things are critical. The monarchy is tyranny. The aristocracy is just there to support the monarchy. And the people, this republican form of government, even though we are a republic in England, are really not. He goes on to say that the king has a check on the commons, where if the House of Commons makes a law, the king can sort of veto that law. But the Commons was designed to put a check on the king. So he's saying if the king has a check on the Commons, is there really any point to having a republican government?
Yeah, which is, I found that section interesting too, because he's saying like all the Commons can really do is just slow down what the king is ultimately going to do. And that this kind of idea of checks and balances, at least the way it was set up then, it's still basically a monarchy just in disguise, or a more subtle form of it. That ultimately, and he says, the crown is the overbearing part of the English constitution. It still hands out official positions and pensions. The English have wisely shut the door and locked it against absolute monarchy, but foolishly given the crown, the king, the key.
Yeah, he is not a fan of monarchy at all. He really loves democracy, Thomas Paine. And he really wants to see America adopt a democratic system, a republican system of government. He thinks that the king is a disease. He says right here first, the king is not to be trusted without being looked after. And in other words, a thirst for absolute power is the natural disease of monarchy. He thinks that the king is basically just a leech off of the system. And he also says, in one point in this, that the point of kings, at least in terms of Israel, the Israelites wanted a king to lead them in battle and to judge them. And he's saying the King of England is neither leading troops in battle, nor is he judging anyone. What's the point of having him? There are British people today who agree with that sentiment.
Right.
Yeah, King Charles's coronation route had a lot of protesters that they had to pan away from on the televised things.
Yeah. Well, and kind of to tie it back to where he's arguing against this, where he's talking about like the origins of the king, he does also, when he's talking about checks and balances, he kind of does say like, all right, if, for example, the kings were appointed by God, then why would we need to create a system in order to check their power? Like, basically the fact that they need to have the commons, checking their power is evidence that they must not be ordained by God.
Yeah. And I think that is why the book is called Common Sense.
Yeah.
It's like, this should be evident.
Yeah.
You guys should realize monarchy is terrible.
The one thing that did make me laugh too along those lines is when he's kind of arguing against hereditary succession. Like, he makes all these arguments against it, and then at the very end he says, quote, "We need not spend much time exposing the folly of hereditary rights to rule. If there are any people so weak as to believe it, let them go ahead and worship the ass and the lion in their turn." Which I just thought was hilarious, because he's, you know, just, it's like, all right, like, if you're such a idiot to believe that hereditary succession is a good idea, like, you're not even worth my time.
It's like, go ahead, do your own thing.
Yeah.
I'm just going to sit here. I'm not going to argue with a fool.
So it is funny, because it is mostly like rational arguments, but then every now and then he throws some jabs in there of just like calling people idiots and weak.
And weak. Nobody wants to be called weak.
Ready to move on to section 3?
I'd be happy to move on to section 3. Yeah,
cool.
Basically, it's common sense now.
Yeah.
Oh, but
so now we're moving away from maybe his more theoretical arguments about, you know, critiquing monarchy in general, and now talking about number 3, the present state of American affairs. So this is like, how does this apply to our current situation?
Yeah. And here's where I am a little more familiar, because this is very much the history. This is him doing his React YouTuber kind of a thing, where he is stepping in and saying, just to read the first sentence, "In the following pages, I offer nothing more than simple facts, plain arguments, and common sense, and have no other preliminaries to settle with the reader than that he will divest himself of prejudice and prepossession and suffer his reason and his feelings to determine for themselves." Basically, he's saying, I am now going to tell you why everything I said in the previous pages is relevant and what is going on. And then he also talks what we can do about it.
Yep.
I think that in this particular section, he is drawing on what he has seen, what he has observed about the state of affairs in America. He says that America is destined for independence. Reconciliation at this point is going to be impossible.
Yeah.
We're never going to be able to repair the relationship with Great Britain. Those of you who want to, that's dumb.
Yeah.
He talks about how we have a true battle ahead of us, and that we're going to need allies. He says nobody is going to help us if we are going to use the resources they give us to fight just to go back to Great Britain. So he is really radically saying, we have to fight. This is going to be the start of a new era in the world.
Yeah, that's great. He uses the analogy a lot of Great Britain being like the mother, and the colonies being, you know, the child. He even says, like, that's oftentimes people's argument for why we shouldn't, you know, separate from Great Britain. Like, oh, it's the mother country. And he has a few objections to this, one of which is like, all right, if we take that to be true, then Britain's a pretty shitty mother. Like, Britain's the kind of mother that, you know, beats their child. He says, some say Britain is our parent country, then the more her conduct shames her. Not even brutes and savages devour their young or make war on their own families. Which, that's not completely true. There are some animals eat their offspring, but we get the point. So yeah, he's saying that, but he's also saying, like, when we actually look at the population of the colonies, he said, quote, less than 1/3 of the inhabitants in Pennsylvania are of English descent. So it's not even really appropriate to call England the mother country. We should maybe call Europe the mother country.
Yes, Europe is the mother country.
Yeah.
The fact is that America is a collection of European rejects. The original English settlers were here because they were religious radicals who the Anglican Church didn't want in their country.
Right.
And a lot of the people who came to America post-French and Indian War were British criminals, basically just being sent over here as a kind of penal colony. Benjamin Franklin writes in some of his personal letters and diaries that he really hates the fact that England is sending the worst of their people to America when they should be sending the best, because America is a land of opportunity and boundless resources, and England is not seeing its potential.
Yeah. In this section, he responds to a lot of the common objections to separation. So we talked about, Britain being the mother country. There's also kind of this idea that America needs Britain.
He says America is the friend of the world. And he says we don't need to be dependent on Britain for protection. One, because we can protect ourselves. Two, because they're the source of all of our problems. We wouldn't have enemies if it wasn't for England. The only reason that we had the French and Indian War is because France had a beef with Britain. France had no beef with the 13 colonies.
It's like if you had a bigger, older brother who, in your mind, you think, I have this bigger, older brother who's always protecting me from any enemies, but really your brother's just an asshole and constantly getting into fights and dragging you into them. Yeah. So it's kind of the idea I wouldn't even have any enemies if it wasn't for this guy. Or
if your sibling is an asshole to his teachers, and then you get to be in that grade, and your teacher's like, oh, you're that guy's sibling. You're going to be a problem, aren't you?
Right.
It's no, I'm not going to be a problem. I'm not that person, but because I'm associated with them.
Guilt by association.
Guilt by association.
So, and then the other thing I guess he's responding to here is that America needs Britain in order to trade with Europe. And I like this. He says, quote, America will always have a market so long as eating is the custom of Europe.
In fact, the port of Boston being closed was far more detrimental to England than it was to anybody else, because England is the person who is trading with the colonies most. He's arguing that if the colonies were independent, we would be trading with anybody. We'd be trading with France. We'd be trading with Holland. We've been trading with Spain.
England's kind of the middleman.
Yeah, England is limiting us.
Yeah.
If we can only trade with England, we don't have the ability to negotiate better prices. We're not going to be able to thrive in the way that America's meant to.
Right. Some of these other arguments, one was just that Britain's being so far away is just kind of a logistical nightmare. Where it's we need to ask permission anytime we do something, and it takes 3 or 4 months to travel across the Atlantic and then back again in order to make anything happen.
It is a logistical nightmare. Benjamin Franklin was doing his best as America's primary diplomat to England, but it just took so long for information to get to him. England would not have found out about the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party for 3 months, and it would take another 3 months to get messages back. It's silly. And I think Thomas Paine puts it pretty well. Small islands not capable of protecting themselves are the proper objects for kingdoms to take under their care. Britain's an island. He's insulting them a little bit.
Yeah.
He's saying maybe stick to other small islands. But it is very absurd in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island. I think Lin-Manuel Miranda says it well, channeling Alexander Hamilton when he writes, "How can a tiny island across the sea regulate the price of tea?" It's silly.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can talk about Paine's proposal for the American government a little bit later. But maybe we can talk a little bit now about Section 5, the present ability of America, which I saw his main arguments here being why the time is now. Why is this the perfect time for separation and we shouldn't delay? He's kind of adding some urgency in this final section.
He is absolutely adding urgency. This is his call to action.
Yeah. Well, in some of these arguments I saw of, why the time to strike is now, one of the things he says is basically like our military is in practice. Like we've kind of just come out of this French-Indian War not too long ago, and that if we wait another 40 or 50 years to try to wage war on Britain, like we might have forgotten how to fight. He says, in 40 or 50 years, that experience would be extinct. We would be as militarily ignorant as the ancient Indians were. And then there's also this idea that like the current American population is the perfect size to separate, and that like we have enough numbers to defeat Britain, but not so, like our population isn't so large that it's going to kind of like slow us down.
Yeah. He mentions that our population is perfect.
Which I don't know how like true this is, but he says, quote, historically, population growth has reduced the size of armies in countries. The ancients far exceeded the moderns in the size of their armies. That is because trade has increased as the population has increased, and people have become too absorbed in commerce to attend to anything else.
Oh yeah, I would argue that's pretty accurate.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. I'm going to bring up Rome here. In the ancient Roman world, there were not a lot of economic opportunities. You could be a farmer, you could be an artisan, or you could be a soldier. There really wasn't a lot of other options. And Rome had legions and legions of soldiers because being a soldier afforded you many economic opportunities. By proving yourself in battle, you could gain land, you could gain status, you could gain citizenship, which is a great thing. But there were not many other options to gaining status unless you already had money or land. And so I think he's arguing that as populations have grown, maybe even as technology has increased, there are so many more jobs, there's so many more things that need done. We don't need as many soldiers, and growth isn't going to be based on military conquest. There's more to do.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, it's kind of counterintuitive. My intuition would lead me to think the larger the population, the larger the army. But at a certain point, it seems that no longer becomes true.
In economics, it's diminishing marginal utility. Every person in a population can contribute to the size of an army, but once your army reaches a certain size, it's not going to be much more effective than it was before.
Yeah.
So like an army of 10,000 people might be super effective. An army of 100,000 people, each additional soldier, each additional person is not going to have as much of an effect and is going to create more of a burden, honestly. I think it's a weird argument, but I think he's right.
Okay, so we have this momentum coming off the French-Indian War. We're kind of, as far as our population goes, we're kind of in this like Goldilocks zone where we have enough people to form a army big enough to defeat Britain, but our population's not too big. And then he also seems to say like the other reason why the time is now is that if we don't leave now, it's going to be harder and harder to leave in the future, and things are just going to keep getting worse. And on that point, he says, any future connection with Britain will be forced and unnatural. It might be convenient for a time, however, it would soon fall into a relapse more wretched than the first.
Yeah, he is super against reconciliation.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of people who wanted reconciliation still, who really believed that the situation could still be remedied. But Thomas Paine is really saying it's not going to happen, and if it does, there's going to be even worse problems in the next 50 years.
The kind of analogy that I kept thinking of when I was reading this is kind of like the domestic violence.
Ooh.
A lot of times when a woman is abused by her husband, she'll leave and then say, well, no, like things are going to get better. And a lot of times if she does go back, things are better for a short period of time. But then oftentimes, after a couple of months of things, the person will change, then things just, relapse and get worse. And that's kind of what this quote brought up for me when he's saying, it might be convenient for a time. However, it would soon fall into a relapse more wretched than the first.
That's a good comparison.
And then I guess the one thing that we kind of skipped over was Paine's proposal of what an American government might look like.
Yeah, I want to talk about that, and I also really want to talk about when he drops a bunch of statistics about warships. Is that okay?
Sure, yeah.
I know this isn't like a history podcast, but...
No, that's cool. Well, to frame this, where he's talking about what a proposed government should look like, he kind of winds up there by saying, the only objection that I think is like a decent objection to why we shouldn't separate is that we don't have any idea of what kind of government we'd even form or like what the path forward would look like. So I think that's kind of how he gets into this.
Yeah, then he drops some suggestions, and they're pretty good suggestions. He suggests a form of government that is pretty similar to what we do end up adopting, but his is much closer to a true democracy than what we end up getting. So when I teach American government, we talk about how the system of government we have is a presidential democracy or a presidential republic. We elect our political leaders, and then they are the ones who make laws for us. And the president represents everybody. He is elected directly by the people. He does talk about having a president with veto power, sort of like the king. But what really interests me is his idea of what the legislature should be. We end up with a bicameral legislature where we have, one House of Representatives. Each state gets a number of representatives based on population, and then we have a Senate, where you have 2 senators from each state. But Thomas Paine wants a system in which each state gets, he said, like 30 members, 30 delegates.
Yeah.
Which at the time would have been kind of crazy.
So it's at least 30 delegates.
At least 30 delegates. Times 13, we're talking a house of at least 390, plus a president. We didn't get a legislature that big until the 1900s. We had a much smaller system. But if we had a system that was that big, I mean, just think how much more accurately would it be representing the people? It's a really cool system that I think is almost a bit of a shame that we didn't get, because it had the potential to be much more truly democratic than what we have now, which is really more Republican. We just elect representatives who make things on our behalf. But if you want to talk to your federal representative, you have to send them a letter, and they're probably not even going to read it. In reality, if you want to talk to a politician, you need to go to your state representative. Those guys are doing some real work. Like, you can actually go to your state representative's office and like have a conversation with them. And if we had a federal system where each state had 30 or more representatives, and I mean, this is a population that was like a tenth of what we have now.
Yeah.
That'd be like each state has like 300 representatives. You would really be able to talk about what is affecting you personally and your community to the people making laws in the federal government. It'd be kind of wild. So, yeah, what he envisions is cool, and it's closer to what I guess was happening in like Holland and Denmark and Sweden.
Yeah, that's great. Do you want to talk about the ships?
Yeah, I do want to talk about the ships, because I think Thomas Paine is kind of prophetic in this writing, especially when he talks about what we're going to need to do in terms of getting help from France or Spain. And while he has some really great ideas about government, founders don't really listen to him.
Yeah.
Very little of what he writes about is adhered to or followed. And I think nothing illustrates this better than when he is talking about the specs of the British Navy and potentially what America could do. So he talks about how England has all of these ships. He's like, they have like 6 ships that have over 100 guns on them, and each of these cost like 35,000 pounds, and in total it's going to be this much. He basically says Britain has a lot of ships. They have a powerful navy. But he also says only 10% of these ships are available to use at a given time. And on top of that, they have these ships spread out over a huge empire. East Indies, West Indies, North America, patrolling the borders of England itself to protect from French bombardment. And he says that America could be a shipbuilding empire. He's like, America's built to make ships. We have iron for days. There's timber all over the place. We can make hemp rope. We can make canvas. We should be a shipbuilding power. But England was actually forbidding the colonies to make warships. 60 years earlier, there were American warships being built that England was using. But not anymore. They have closed that trade avenue. And he is saying that we could easily build a navy a tenth the size of what England has. And that small army, that small navy we have, would dwarf the amount of ships that Britain can possibly send against us. Because he's like, they only have 10% of their available ships ready at any given time. And only like 5% of that is going to actually be able to patrol America. He says right now, America is defenseless. If a single pirate were to go and invade Philadelphia or ride up the Chesapeake, they would be able to just take the towns for everything they have. Because England was prohibiting us from having standing armies and from building ships for ourselves.
And that's kind of the idea that, like, they weren't allowing us to basically, like, protect ourselves.
No, they're not allowing us to protect ourselves. They're hindering us. They're stopping our potential. And he is so enthusiastic about American shipbuilding. Shipbuilding is America's greatest pride, in which she will excel the whole world. He's right. We have the largest navy in the world. We've had the largest navy for a long time. But it isn't until the 20th century that we realize that dream.
Yeah, super interesting, but kind of like we mentioned earlier, wasn't the section that really had the giant impact on American history. So I was thinking maybe we could read this last paragraph and kind of unpack it.
All right. Do you want to read this one?
Yeah, do you mind if I read your...
Totally.
Okay. All right. So yeah, this is the very end. This is in the appendix of the first edition. On these grounds I rest the matter, and as no author hath yet been made to refute the doctrine contained in the former editions of this pamphlet, it is a negative proof, and that either the doctrine cannot be refuted, or that the party in favor of it are too numerous to be opposed. Wherefore, instead of gazing at each other with suspicious or doubtful curiosity, let each of us hold out his neighbor the hearty hand of friendship, and unite in drawing a line, which, like an act of oblivion, shall bury in forgetfulness every former dissension. Let the names of Whig and Tory be extinct, and let none other be heard among us than those of a good citizen, and an open and resolute friend, and a virtuous supporter of the rights of mankind, and the free and independent states of America. Woo! So pretty powerful.
Bravo.
Pretty powerful way to end it, where he's just really kind of bringing it all together, saying, like, let's put aside our, party differences and join together as America. And as you mentioned earlier, like, even using America there is maybe a big deal.
I think it is. It is And he's saying the independent states of America, we're not just 13 separate countries. We are one America, and we're all going to have to unite. The burdens of one must be the burdens of all.
Very
Thomas
cool.
Paine unites America through the reading of this book in many taverns across the various states.
A British man.
A British man.
And I thought it was interesting too that I guess the first edition, it was signed, like written by a British man or something, and Thomas Paine wanted to get rid of that.
Yeah,
which is probably a good idea. People
really
probably
is.
like it packs more of a punch if you don't realize that he's British.
I mean, yeah, it wouldn't have been as impactful if you knew, oh yeah, this is a guy who was in America for 13 months before he wrote this.
Yeah, right.
Like, if you don't know who the author is, you think this guy is like a born and bred American. This guy has been to all the colonies. He's seen everybody's problems, and he knows the way to fix it. But he really isn't. He's just a guy who came over here, saw what the problem was, and had some ideas for how to fix it.
Yeah, which is great. And maybe we could wrap up by talking about like what the effects of this were and kind of what happened to good old Thomas Paine.
Oh yeah. So the effects of this book, astronomical. If it were not for common sense, it is possible that we would not have been able to unite. Really, the fact that this book was read publicly inspired a lot of people to actually join the war effort. It bolstered George Washington's numbers. Thomas Paine himself actually would go to serve with George Washington, following them through several battles. Even though he was an incredibly influential writer in the form of this pamphlet, and he was an ambassador and a foreign affairs coordinator during under the First Continental Congress. He really gets ignored a lot during the founding of the country. But that does not diminish the effect that he had on the revolution and really the world today.
Yeah, and he might have just been like too far ahead of his time as well. Because I also heard some accounts that he was one of the first proponents of like modern welfare state.
Yeah, the agrarian society.
Something, yeah.
He was really, really popular among the, like, what you would call middle class. You would say maybe he's even sort of like a labor activist. He certainly was earlier in his life. And if he had, ever gone into just one of the pubs and read this himself, I can just kind of imagine him sort of stirring everybody up.
Yeah, it's kind of it's like almost like meant to be read out loud in a pub. Like it's witty, it's kind of scathing at times, and like definitely packs a punch. And it doesn't mince words. Like, it's very clear what the message is. Like, even reading this now, I was like, yeah, like let's separate from Britain. Like, you're kind of like,
down with the monarchy.
Any good propaganda piece will do. Get you fired up.
Yeah, he's firing people up.
So this was great, man. Thank you so much for going through it all with me. I got a ton out of this, and like I said, this was one that I had never read, so it was really great to do a deep dive.
Absolutely. Thank you, Zach.
Hey, this is Zach. Thanks for listening to Unpacking Ideas. If you're enjoying the podcast so far, be sure to follow it so that you get notified every time I release an episode. And if you're listening on Spotify or Apple, I'd really appreciate if you could take a few seconds to rate the show. This really helps with the algorithm so that more people can discover it. Also, if you would like to get in touch with me or to hear about what's coming up next on the podcast, visit unpackingideas.com/podcast. And there I post links to books and essays that we'll be discussing on future podcast episodes. All right, that's going to do it for today. Thanks so much for listening, and I will see you next episode.